So let's go over this first lesson where we're going to learn a little bit about the introduction to anatomy and physiology, and we're also going to learn a little chemistry.
The human body is amazing and complex. The study of anatomy and physiology will give you the opportunity to explore the many systems of the body and to see how they impact one another. Anatomy and physiology are two fields of medical science that study the parts of the body and how they function to maintain life, each from a different perspective. Anatomy, Greek for a cutting up, examines the structures of the body. This includes bones, organs, tissues, muscles, and blood vessels. Physiology, Greek for relationship to nature, studies the function of those body parts, what they do, and how they do it. Forensic scientists, doctors, nurses, veterinarians, coroners, nutritionists, and physical therapists are some of the careers that apply the knowledge of anatomy and physiology. Together, these two fields of study show us the relationship between structure and function in the body.
So let's talk a little bit about anatomy and physiology and what these ideas actually mean. So you can see the anatomy is the study of the actual structure or something, and that can be subdivided into different major parts. For instance, gross or macroscopic anatomy is talking about regional, systematic, or surface anatomy. And we normally, when we think about this, we think about going to med school and taking a gross anatomy class where they'll have a human cadaver there, and you'll be able to look at full organ systems or look throughout different regions and see where different organs are, and just to look at large scale types of structure. The microscopic anatomy are going to be things that we focus on here in a few weeks when we're talking about cytology or histology. So here when we go into cytology, we're going to look at cells. When we go into histology, we're going to look at tissues. And both of those, we're going to use a microscope to look at them because they're very small. That's microscopic. And then developmental anatomy has to do with embryology, and this is looking at how basically the body is developing through different stages. So embryology is a study of the development of the embryo. Now, physiology has to do more with the study of the function of the body. And basically, this area is subdivided based on the organ system itself. And so this often is going to focus on either cellular or molecular levels. So we're talking about things like biochemistry. And we're looking at the body's ability to react depending on chemical reactions in the individual cell, right? And so this is basically how things work on a molecular or cellular level. And so we have this idea of the principle of complementarity. And this just means that when we study anatomy and physiology, that we're studying together, that they're inseparable. When we're looking at how something works or the function of it, it's always going to be a reflection of the structure. And what a structure can do is going to depend on its specific form. So whenever you're looking at this, even if you're taking just a physiology class, you are going to be learning anatomy because they're kind of together in this pair. Now, sorry about that. So when we're looking at what is anatomy and physiology, let's do this quick questionnaire. It's the study of structure. B, the study of the function of the body. I am so sorry. I am getting tons of emails right now. C, the systematic study of the physical and natural world through observation and experimentation. D, both A and B, or E, none of the above. Hopefully you picked D. It's both the study, structure, and function of the body. What is an example of microscopic anatomy? Is it regional A, histology B, C, cytology, D, both A and B, or C, both A and C? Or is it F? Oops, sorry guys. None of the above. Hopefully I tripped you up there for a second and you were like, I don't see the answer, because essentially microscopic would be both what? B and C here, right? So on this, it would be none of the above because you would need to pick both. Tried to trip you up there a little bit, didn't I? Now, when we're looking at the different structure in the body actually has this biological organization. And so it starts from something that is really small and builds on each other until you're looking at something big. And so it starts on a chemical structure looking at like atoms and molecules. And this will be what we go over in both chapter 2 and 3. Then it's going to move up to a cellular level, looking at cells. And that's going to be chapter 3. And cells basically come together to form tissues. And tissues are basically similar types of cells all working together for a common function. So then you're going to go here. Now different tissues come together to make up organs. Different organs come together to make up organ systems. And when you look at all organ systems closely working together, the next level of function is the actual organism. So it looks much like this. As you can see, here is this first structure. Here is the chemical level. You can see individual atoms, which we'll talk about here in a second, come together and bond to form molecules. These molecules are going to come together to make separate parts of things like organelles. Organelles are going to be made of these big biomolecules, and organelles all come together to make cells, or at least eukaryotic cells that we're looking at here. An example here is smooth muscle. So this is when we get into the basically cellular level when we're looking at muscles. And then similar cells come together for a common function, which is the tissue level. And you can see smooth muscle tissue here, right? And those basically can come together, different types of tissues, to make organs. So it's showing you blood vessel here because you have epithelial tissue that's lining it. The outside to help with structures, connective tissue. Then you have smooth muscle in the middle here. Now you can have all of those different organs, blood vessels, and heart come together to make the cardiovascular system, which is the organ. The different parts of it are the organ, or all of them working together as an organ system, and that goes into different organ systems are going to make the organismal level. And this is showing a human organism. So place these different things in order. Which one comes first? Hopefully you said atoms, right? And then from atoms we have molecules. And from molecules, they come together to form what? Organelles. And organelles make up parts of cells. Cells come together to make tissues. Different tissue types work and function to make a organ system. Now what's missing in there? Hopefully you realize that organs themselves are missing. And then your last is a organism. So let's watch this really quick and let's think about what this little dude has in common with us. So here you can see, just to let you know, that this thing that just engulfed is an amoeba, right? And it is eating some paramecium on here. So I'm going to restart this again and let you see it. So hopefully what you've noticed is that this amoeba, you can see it has boundaries, kind of like the cell wall that we have, right? So it has a boundary that maintains what is outside from inside. Now it moved from over here and engulfed this paramecium, right? So it has movement. You can see both these guys were basically responding to the environment. This amoeba that we see here, right, came, felt these little guys, and started coming over and for food. This guy, once he started getting enveloped, realized that there were digestive juices coming, and so he started moving around. So they have this excitability or this responsiveness. Now, hopefully you notice that he was digesting him, right? Yum. And so you have that. In order for this to continue on, you're going to take those molecules from the digestion and metabolize them and make energy. Of course, this guy is going to get rid of any of the waste here. During the course of his development, he's going to grow and then he reproduces. So these are things we have in common with him, right? And this is what are known as necessarily life functions. We do both of these things, right? Both the amoeba does it, we do it. Now, we do differ from an amoeba a little bit, as in we are multicellular and he is just one. So he just needs to keep his single cell alive, which is him. Where we must keep individual cells alive. There's a lot of them, and a lot of them require slightly different things, right? All the cells that we have depend on organ systems to meet their survival needs. So, for instance, what the skin cells need to survive are going to be a little bit different than what a neuron or a brain cell will need. And so, us as a multicellular organism, we need to figure out what each of those needs so that we can provide them. All body functions spread among different organ systems. And basically, organ systems cooperate to maintain life. And we're just going to get this part out of here because this is something we're doing in the lab. You don't have to worry about it. Now, in order for us to survive, we need appropriate amounts of all the following, right? We need nutrients, oxygen, water, normal body temperature, and the appropriate atmospheric pressure. So, nutrients. So, when we're talking about nutrients, we're talking about chemical energy. And this is what our body needs to build cells, to maintain chemical reactions, all of these things. So nutrients are really, really, really important. We need oxygen, and we need oxygen because, as you will figure out in a couple lessons, is oxygen allows us to make what's known as adenosine triphosphate. And that is an energy molecule used to allow reactions to happen in our body. And those reactions are things that help to, this provides enough energy for things to happen that we need, whether it's to make molecules that essentially will build cells or if it's needed to break molecules down, but it's extremely important. Now, water. is the most abundant chemical in the body. On average, it's about 65% of your body. Now, for infants, it's a little bit more, which is 75%. And for the obese, it's less, 45%. And you'll find out with the obese, it makes sense because water is a polar molecule and fat is a nonpolar, and they don't like each other. So if you have excess fat in your body, really need to stay well hydrated. Now, and we'll find out why water is really important. It's most important solvent. It helps to basically mediate a lot of molecules in the body throughout. So it's extremely important. And you have normal body temperature, which is 37 degrees Celsius. We know it as 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But most of the time, you're going to work in Celsius and not Fahrenheit. And we need the appropriate atmospheric pressure. And why that is important is with the right pressure, we get adequate breathing and basically that gas exchange in the lungs back and forth. Now, too much or too little of all these things is not good. You need just the right amount for survival. And we need all of these things, and we need our body to basically maintain what's known as homeostasis. And homeostasis is this idea of maintaining a stable internal environment. To do this requires a lot of energy. You need molecules like adenosine triphosphate, and you need nutrients to allow to make this chemical energy. It's maintained by your organ systems working together to provide this nice stable environment. Like it says, in contrast to our amoeba friends, we have about 75 trillion cells which make their own internal environment, which remains constant despite all the external fluctuations from the environment. So let's talk about what a homeostasis is and the control mechanism behind it. So you'll see this throughout the books. And basically, when we're talking about this, we're talking about how we maintain a nice, stable environment. So you see that this is like a teeter-totter, and we want it to balance. But throughout time, our body is going to go back and forth like this. It's going to get imbalanced a little high on one side, so your body's going to respond to bring it down on the other. And it's basically this balancing act the whole time. And so you want to be able to do this throughout the book, be able to identify what are our main things here. For instance, the stimulus is the initial item that produces change, right? And that stimulus is detected by the receptor. Now the receptor is going to take the input that it has and basically shuttle it to the control center. Now this part of this mechanism is what's known as the afferent pathway. And you can think A for away from the initial stimulus. Now, in most of our examples, we're going to talk about the brain being the control center, whether it's certain regulatory, like the hippocampus, or in the brain, or but for the most part, there's going to be some kind of part of the brain, and it's not always the case, but in a couple of the examples that we'll use, it's a big indicator, is going to be the control center. And so that's the area that's going to be able to take the input and integrate it to deduce a response. The control center is going to take the information and output it to the effector. And this is what's known as the efferent pathway. and you can think that it's going to make an effect, right? And basically the effector is going to basically elicit a response. And that's what's going to change. And so you can think of this in terms of you have a situation, what maintains homeostasis in your house? And it's going to be different for each person, right? So you can say what's the stimulus or what produces change in the house. And a lot of times, for me at least, it was my kiddo. So the kids do something or other, right? They break something. And then I was in the house, I would basically sit there and I would see it. And not to be too sexist here, right? I would see it, I would sit there and go, okay, what needs to be done with it? So I'm seeing it, which is the receptor, you might hear it, right? And then you're going to determine what's going to happen. And then maybe you say something, this is like a leave it to beaver. Well, just wait till your dad gets home. He's going to whip their butt, right? And so he essentially would come home and spank them. That would be the effector. So, but let's actually give it something that is a little bit less sexist in that, because, every house is a little different. And we're going to talk about a process that undergoes homeostatic control that is what's known as a negative feedback loop. So negative feedback is the most common mechanism in the body, or feedback mechanism. And basically what this is there's a response that reduces or shuts off the original stimulus. That's why it's called negative. It's kind of like if you sit there and there's a baby screaming and crying, wah! You don't want to kick the baby to make the baby scream and cry more. That's what would be positive feedback. You increase what's happening. You want the baby to stop crying, so you're going to do something to reduce that initial stimulus. So if that baby is screaming its head off, then you're going to put a bottle in the mouth. And so essentially you're shutting off that screaming. That's what negative feedback is. So it's just basically a variable change in the opposite direction of the initial change. And so we have stuff like the regulation of blood glucose by insulin. This is an endocrine system mechanism. And the one that we're going to look at first is a regulation of body temperature, which is a nervous system mechanism.
The same part of your brain that's controlling your heart is looking after the outside of you too. Your body needs to maintain a constant temperature of 37 degrees centigrade, and your brain has a range of tricks up its sleeve to do it. This is skin magnified 1,000 times. If you look closely, it's covered in holes. They're the openings of tiny ducts, tubes through which sweat can flow. There are about 65,000 of them on the palm of your hand alone. If you're getting too hot, your brain switches on your sweat glands. As the sweat evaporates, it'll help cool you down. And should your brain decide that staying warm is what's needed, it's got another plan. Goose pimples. They trap warm air near to the skin and so keep vital heat in. So, all that is being controlled from here, inside your head. And don't think you'll get out of all the hard work by nodding off.
So, let's talk about homeostasis really quick. So, you basically see when you have, let's start right here. Our stimulus is heat. So basically what's happening is that your body's warming up and the body temperature is rising. Now, that's your stimulus. That stimulus has to be picked up by something, which is a receptor, right? And so the receptors here are temperature sensitive cells that are both in your brain and in your skin that is able to pick up those changes. And they relate those changes to the control center. And that control center is within the brain. And you have thermoregulatory centers in the actual brain that can pick up and figure out what to do with that increase in heat, right? Now, the pathway that leads to the control center is the afferent. Remember, it's going away from the initial stimulus. Now, within the hippocampus of the brain, it decides to determine what we're going to do at that moment. And so it's going to talk to sweat glands, right? And the sweat glands are going to say, okay, we need to release water so that we can reduce some of this temperature. And so the sweat glands are the effectors. And this pathway here is what's known as the efferent pathway. Now, basically how this works is you get a layer of water on the top of your skin. And how we're able to pull heat off is it takes a certain amount of energy, which is in the form of heat, to allow the water to first break its bond with other water molecules and then evaporate, right? And so the evaporation of the actual sweat, and there should be an A in there, is going to be what essentially pulls the energy away from this gentleman, right, and reduces the temperature. Now, so this is what's known as negative feedback, right? The original stimulus is heat, it's hot, and so we're producing a response that turns it off. Now, what's going to happen is over time your body temperature is going to fall, and then it's going to become too cold. And so that's the second part of this. It's a stimulus again, right? And so those receptors that determine temperature are going to basically determine that it's too cold. They're going to talk to the control center, which are those thermoregulatory centers in the brain. That's going to tell basically the body or the skeletal muscle specifically to start activating. Thus, that's why you shiver, because when your muscles themselves move, they produce a certain amount of useless energy, which is in the form of heat. And so you start shaking, which produces heat, and essentially it increases the body temperature. The first half of this, again, efferent pathway away from the original stimulus. The second part, efferent, which is taking an effect by the effector. So that's an example of homeostasis, and this is negative feedback loop. A positive, just like I was saying earlier, if you have a baby and it's crying and then you smack it or kick it so that it cries more, that would be positive feedback, right? So don't get positive or negative as in being good or bad. It's just what it's doing to the original stimulus. In this case, it's creating more or it's enhancing it. And so there may exhibit a cascade or amplifying effect, and it usually controls infrequent events that don't require continuous adjustment. So think when you get oxytocin, that gets released during labor contractions. You're not in labor all the time, right? It's something that happens whenever you are having a child. So when a little bit of it comes out, then it's going to increase labor contractions. More is going to come out, and so it increases the response. And the same thing happens with platelet plug formation and blood clotting. You're not constantly having to worry about blood clotting unless there's a small scratch or if you have a cut or anything like that. So during those cases, when you have certain factors being released, those factors increase platelet plug formation. So these are examples of positive feedback. Now you can have disturbances to homeostasis, and that is what essentially is going to increase the risk of diseases, right? So this is what kind of contributes to changes that are associated with age. These control systems become less efficient as you get older. And just to let you know, if these things happen and say negative feedback mechanisms are overwhelmed, kind of positive destructive feedback mechanisms may take over. And this is an example in heart failure. So we're going to stop here with this one, and we will start hearing again with part 2.